Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Mississippi. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know what places and what times of day or night these documented stories reach. The year was 1849, and Willow Creek Plantation stood as a testament to the prosperity that cotton had brought to Adams County, Mississippi. Nestled along the eastern bank of the Mississippi River, just 12 miles south of Natchez, the plantation's white-columned mansion gleamed in the southern sun, a beacon of wealth and supposed gentility. From a distance, it appeared no different than the dozens of other grand estates that dotted the landscape, but locals knew better. They avoided the property when possible, and workers from neighboring plantations would fall silent when passing its gates. There was something about Willow Creek that inspired a particular kind of dread. At the center of this unease was Madeline Thornwood, the mistress of Willow Creek. Born to a wealthy New Orleans family in 1801, she had inherited the plantation after the death of her husband, Colonel James Thornwood, in 1845. The colonel had been a respected figure in Mississippi society, stern but fair, according to accounts recorded in the Natchez Courier. His death from typhoid fever left Madeline alone to manage the estate's affairs, and it was then that things at Willow Creek began to change. The first documented peculiarity appeared in the Adams County Ledger in early 1846, where an unusual number of recorded deaths at Willow Creek caught the attention of a county clerk. 19 deaths in the span of 6 months, all attributed to fever, natural causes, or simply the Lord's will. The clerk made a notation in the margin, "Frequency at WC concerning." No official inquiry followed. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not merely the number of deaths, but the circumstances that were later uncovered through a collection of letters, diary entries, and testimonies gathered by Reverend Thomas Whitfield in the spring of 1853. These documents, microfilmed by the Mississippi Historical Society in 1962 and subsequently stored in their archives in Jackson, reveal a pattern of behavior that defies conventional understanding. In the personal diary of Eleanor Prescott, a neighbor who visited the Thornwood estate in April 1847, we find the first mention of Madeline's peculiar religious practices. Mrs. T speaks at length about purification, Eleanor wrote. She regards water not merely as symbolic, but as literally transformative. The hotter the water, she insists, the more complete the cleansing of sin. I found her views unsettling, though she speaks with such conviction that one cannot help but listen. What Eleanor Prescott could not have known then was that Madeline's theological obsession would evolve into something far more sinister than eccentric belief. The plantation's ledgers, kept meticulously by Madeline herself, show increasing expenses for firewood, metal cauldrons, and medicinal supplies beginning in late 1847. By 1848, the ledgers note weekly expenditures for baptismal preparations and implements of purification. The domestic staff at Willow Creek was reduced during this period, with only Madeline's longtime maid, Harriet, and the elderly house cook, Solomon, maintained in their positions within the main house. All others were relocated to the fields or to outbuildings far from the mansion. According to Solomon's testimony, given to Reverend Whitfield in 1853, Madeline began to withdraw from society after a visit from a traveling preacher in the summer of 1847. This preacher, whose name does not appear in any official records, reportedly stayed at Willow Creek for 3 days. After he left, Solomon recounted, Mistress wouldn't eat with nobody else, took her meals alone in the east parlor, started reading her Bible day and night, marking pages with red ribbon. The east parlor would later become central to the horror of Willow Creek. It was a spacious room originally designed for entertaining, with tall windows overlooking the garden and the distant river beyond. Madeline ordered the room's furniture removed in November 1847, except for a single chair where she would sit for hours, reading her Bible. The hardwood floors were covered with thick canvas tarps. And at the center of the room, according to multiple accounts, stood three large iron cauldrons. The plantation's carpenter, a man named Isaiah, provided testimony that in the winter of 1847, Madeline ordered the construction of a specialized stone hearth in the east parlor large enough to heat multiple cauldrons simultaneously. Isaiah described Madeline as changed during this period. She didn't speak much, he recalled, but her eyes never left you while you worked. Always watching, like she could see something in you that you couldn't see yourself. By the spring of 1848, Madeline had largely withdrawn from the social circles that had once been central to plantation life. She declined invitations to gatherings in Natchez and ceased hosting the seasonal parties that had been a Thornwood tradition. This social retreat was noted with concern in the letters of Carolyn Holbrook, wife of a neighboring planter, who wrote to her sister in Virginia, "Madeline has become a recluse, and rumors abound as to the reason. Some say grief has finally overtaken her, though it has been 3 years since the colonel's passing. Others whisper of madness, though I hesitate to give credence to such talk. It was during this period of isolation that the purification rituals appear to have begun." According to household accounts, Madeline began summoning individuals to the main house at irregular intervals. They would be brought to the east parlor and would not emerge until hours later, often unable to return to work for days afterward. Harriet's testimony provides the most detailed account of what occurred in that room, though her statement, recorded by Reverend Whitfield, is fragmented and at times incoherent. Mistress said the water had to be just right, Harriet recalled. Not warm but not bubbling neither. She'd test it with a feather. If the feather curled but didn't burn away, she said that was the Lord's temperature. Harriet described how Madeline would read passages from Leviticus and Revelations while the water heated. She'd say that sin was like dirt under the skin, and only the right heat could draw it out. What followed, according to multiple testimonies compiled in Reverend Whitfield's investigation, was what Madeline referred to as true baptism. Individuals would be made to stand in the center of the room while Madeline circled them, reciting scripture. She would speak of purification, of cleansing, of becoming new in the eyes of the Lord. And then, using a silver ladle that had once belonged to her mother-in-law, she would begin the baptism, pouring water from the cauldrons over the heads and shoulders of those she had selected for the ritual. The water, as multiple accounts confirm, was not merely warm. It was heated to just below boiling, hot enough to cause intense pain and blistering, but not immediately fatal. Madeline believed this specific temperature had theological significance. In a letter found in her desk after the events of 1849, addressed to her deceased husband, she wrote, "James, I have discovered what John the Baptist could not. It is not water alone that cleanses, nor is it fire alone that purifies. It is the precise meeting of the two, water heated to the threshold of transformation, that burns away sin while leaving the soul intact." The physical effects of these baptisms were severe. Dr. William Carver, who eventually treated several survivors, noted in his medical journal extensive burns primarily on the upper body, shoulders, and scalp. "The injuries," he wrote, "appear consistent with prolonged exposure to water heated to a temperature of approximately 180 degrees Fahrenheit. Recovery, where possible, is lengthy and leaves substantial scarring. Perhaps most disturbing is the account of Madeline's behavior during these rituals. According to Harriet, she remained eerily calm throughout, speaking in a measured tone even as those before her screamed in agony. She never raised her voice," Harriet testified, "not once, just kept pouring and speaking about washing away the darkness. Sometimes she'd smile, like she was seeing something beautiful that nobody else could see." By late 1848, the frequency of these rituals had increased. Madeline's personal diary, recovered during the subsequent investigation, reveals an escalating belief that her methods were divinely sanctioned. "The transformation is remarkable," she wrote in October 1848. "I can see the sin leaving them as the water flows. Their cries are not of pain but of release, the sound of souls being unburdened." The Lord has shown me that I must continue this work. The plantation's productivity declined sharply during this period, as those who underwent Madeline's baptisms were often unable to work for weeks afterward. Some never recovered sufficiently to return to their duties. This decline was noted by James Harris, who managed the business affairs of several neighboring plantations and who wrote to a business associate in New Orleans. Willow Creek's yield is down nearly 40% from last year. I've heard troubling accounts of mismanagement by the widow Thornwood. There are whispers of cruelty beyond the ordinary, though no one speaks openly of it. No official action was taken regarding the situation at Willow Creek until early 1849, when Dr. Carver, alarmed by the patterns of injuries he was treating, attempted to alert local authorities. His concerns, however, were largely dismissed. Madeline Thornwood's position in society, combined with the prevailing attitudes of the time, insulated her from serious scrutiny. As one county official reportedly told Dr. Carver, a woman may manage her household as she sees fit. What is particularly telling about the social dynamics that allowed Madeline's practices to continue is revealed in a series of letters exchanged between two prominent Natchez families in February 1849. The correspondence, preserved in the Natchez Historical Society archives, shows a clear awareness of unusual occurrences at Willow Creek, coupled with a deliberate choice not to intervene. "The Thornwood situation grows more concerning," wrote Elizabeth Montgomery to her cousin. "Carolyn says she heard the most dreadful sounds when passing near the property last week. Yet what can be done? To question a widow's management of her estate would set a troubling precedent." This reluctance to interfere extended even to the local clergy. Reverend Jonathan Pierce, pastor of the Presbyterian Church that the Thornwoods had attended before the colonel's death, noted in his personal journal that he had called upon Madeline twice in 1848 after hearing rumors of her increasingly erratic behavior. On both occasions he was denied entry to the house. "Mrs. Thornwood sent word through her maid that she is engaged in private devotions and cannot be disturbed," Pierce wrote. "I find it curious that these devotions have apparently continued for 6 weeks without interruption. However, a lady's religious practices are her own affair, provided they remain within the bounds of Christian doctrine." The details of what occurred behind the closed doors of Willow Creek became more widely known only after events reached their horrific climax in August 1849. Until that point, the surrounding community maintained what one later observer called a conspiracy of politeness, a tacit agreement not to acknowledge the increasingly obvious signs that something was terribly wrong at the Thornwood plantation. This silence was not merely a matter of social delicacy. Economic and political considerations played a significant role. The Thornwood family had deep connections throughout Adams County and beyond. Colonel James Thornwood had served in the state legislature and had financial ties to many of the region's most prominent citizens. To question his widow's behavior was to potentially disrupt a complex network of relationships and business arrangements. Moreover, the religious climate of the time created a context in which Madeline's extreme interpretations of Scripture, while unusual, were not entirely beyond the pale. The Second Great Awakening had swept through the region in the preceding decades, bringing with it intense religious fervor and sometimes unconventional expressions of faith. While Madeline's practices were far more extreme than mainstream religious observance, they emerged from a cultural environment that placed high value on personal religious experience and direct divine revelation. A document discovered in the Mississippi State Archives in 1968 sheds additional light on this religious context. The pamphlet, published anonymously in 1844 and titled "On Physical Purification and Spiritual Cleansing, advocates for an interpretation of baptism that emphasizes physical discomfort as a necessary component of spiritual transformation." While the author stops well short of recommending anything approaching Madeline's methods, there are disturbing parallels in the theological reasoning presented. Handwriting analysis has suggested that the pamphlet may have been annotated by Colonel Thornwood himself, raising questions about whether Madeline's ideas developed in isolation or were influenced by her husband's reading. Throughout the spring and early summer of 1849, conditions at Willow Creek continued to deteriorate. The plantation's accounts show increasing expenditures for medical supplies, particularly linseed oil and bandaging materials, items commonly used in the treatment of burns during this period. Simultaneously, the financial ledgers record a sharp decline in plantation productivity and mounting debts to suppliers in Natchez and New Orleans. In June 1849, a merchant from Natchez named Harold Whitaker visited Willow Creek to discuss outstanding payments. His account of this visit, later given to Reverend Whitfield, provides a glimpse of the plantation's atmosphere during this period. The house had a peculiar smell, Whitaker recalled, like laundry day but sharper, more acrid. The windows of the east parlor were covered, though I could hear movement within. Mrs. Thornwood received me in the library, seated with her back to the window so that her face remained in shadow. She spoke coherently of business matters, but seemed distracted, repeatedly turning the conversation to theological questions I was ill-equipped to address. Whitaker also noted that during his hour-long visit, he heard a continuous sound of water being poured and what might have been prayers or chanting coming from elsewhere in the house. When he inquired about the sound, Madeline reportedly smiled and said, "The work of purification never ceases, Mr. Whitaker. The Lord's cauldrons must always be ready." By July 1849, neighboring plantation owners had begun to express concerns not just about the declining condition of Willow Creek, but about potential effects on their own properties. A letter from William Carrington to James Harris, dated July 12, 1849, states, "The situation at the Thornwood place grows untenable. There are rumors spreading among our own people, creating unease. Mrs. Peterson claims her cousin at Willow Creek hasn't been seen in 3 weeks, though Madeline insists he is merely recovering from illness. Something must be done, yet no one seems willing to take the first step." The first step would ultimately come not from community leaders or legal authorities, but from an unexpected quarter. On August 2, 1849, a young man named Thomas Blackwood, who worked as a clerk for a Natchez law firm, traveled to Willow Creek on an errand to deliver documents related to Colonel Thornwood's estate. What he witnessed that day would finally break the silence surrounding Madeline's activities. According to Blackwood's sworn statement given to a Natchez magistrate on August 4th, he arrived at Willow Creek around mid-morning and was directed by Harriet to wait in the entrance hall, while she informed Madeline of his arrival. "I could hear what sounded like a kettle boiling somewhere in the house," Blackwood testified. "There was a smell like wet cloth and something else I couldn't identify. After waiting nearly half an hour, I heard a scream that seemed to come from the east wing of the house." Blackwood's testimony continues. "It wasn't a brief cry but a sustained sound that rose and fell. No one came to attend to me, and after hearing a second scream, I felt compelled to investigate." What he found in the east parlor was Madeline Thornwood standing beside 3 large cauldrons, reading aloud from a Bible, while systematically pouring heated water over a man who appeared to be restrained by some means. The victim's skin was red and blistering, Blackwood stated. Mrs. Thornwood seemed completely unaffected by his cries, continuing to read and pour, as if performing the most ordinary household task. Blackwood's account describes how he immediately fled the house and rode directly to Natchez, where he reported what he had seen to his employer, attorney Richard Holbrook. Holbrook, recognizing the seriousness of the situation, but also its potential to scandalize respectable society, advised discretion. He arranged for Blackwood to speak privately with Judge William Montgomery the following day. Montgomery, who had been a friend of Colonel Thornwood, was initially skeptical of Blackwood's claims. "The judge suggested I might have misinterpreted some form of medical treatment," Blackwood later recalled. "It was only when I described the specific arrangement of the room and the expression on Mrs. Thornwood's face, a look of serene detachment that chilled me more than the victim's screams, that he seemed to take my account seriously." Even then, the response was measured and private. Rather than involving local law enforcement directly, Montgomery dispatched his personal physician, Dr. James Wilson, to Willow Creek under the pretext of a social call to check on Madeline's health. Dr. Wilson was refused entry, but reported seeing smoke from multiple chimneys despite the summer heat and hearing what he described as sounds of distress from within the house. This report, combined with Blackwood's testimony, finally prompted Judge Montgomery to take more decisive action. On August 10th, he issued a private order for Dr. Carver to visit Willow Creek with the authority to examine any individuals there who might require medical attention. The judge's written instruction, preserved in the county archives, carefully frames this intervention not as a response to potential wrongdoing, but as a concern for public health. In light of reports suggesting the possibility of fever or other contagion at the Thornwood estate, Dr. William Carver is hereby authorized to conduct examinations as necessary to ensure the general welfare. Dr. Carver's visit on August 11th was the beginning of the end for Madeline's reign of terror at Willow Creek. According to his subsequent report, he found multiple individuals suffering from severe burns in various stages of healing. Most significantly, he discovered 3 recent victims with life-threatening injuries in a secluded outbuilding that had been converted into what Madeline apparently called her recovery chapel. The conditions were appalling, Dr. Carver wrote. The patients lay on bare wooden pallets, their burns untreated, except for the application of what appeared to be a mixture of lard and herbs. 2 were semi-conscious, muttering prayers or delirious phrases. The third, a man of approximately 30 years of age, was lucid enough to provide an account of what had been done to him. This man, identified in Dr. Carver's notes only as Samuel, described being subjected to what Madeline called complete baptism, an escalation of her previous practices in which the heated water was applied not just to the head and shoulders, but to the entire body in stages. She said, "My resistance to earlier purification showed that the sin was buried deeper than she had thought," Samuel told Dr. Carver. She spoke of layers of corruption that required more thorough treatment. Samuel's testimony, recorded by Dr. Carver and later entered into court records, provides the most detailed account of Madeline's methods and beliefs at their most extreme. According to Samuel, Madeline had developed an elaborate theology around her practices, believing that different temperatures of water would draw out different types of sin. She had it all worked out, he reported. Lukewarm for ordinary transgressions, hotter for persistent vices, and near boiling for what she called soul-deep corruption. She kept precise records of each baptism, noting the temperature used and the results observed. What makes Samuel's account particularly disturbing is his description of Madeline's apparent sincerity. She wasn't cruel in the ordinary way, he told Dr. Carver. There was no anger in her, no pleasure in causing pain. She spoke gently throughout, calling it a necessary process, promising that the agony was temporary, but the purification eternal. That made it worse somehow, that she believed she was helping us. Dr. Carver immediately arranged for the removal of all 3 victims to his clinic in Natchez. 2 survived. Samuel, despite initially appearing to be recovering, developed an infection and died 3 days later. His final statement, witnessed by Dr. Carver and Reverend Pierce, was entered into the court record during subsequent proceedings. She thought she was saving us. That's what haunts me most, not the pain, but the look in her eyes. She truly believed. Upon receiving Dr. Carver's report, Judge Montgomery faced a difficult decision. The evidence of Madeline's actions was now undeniable, yet there remained the question of how to respond in a way that would address the harm done while minimizing scandal. The solution, characteristic of the time and place, was to treat the matter not as a criminal case, but as a question of Madeline's mental competence. On August 15, 1849, Montgomery convened a closed hearing to determine whether Madeline Thornwood was of sound mind and capable of managing her affairs. The proceedings were not public, and the record was sealed under a court order that wasn't lifted until 1925. The testimony presented, now available to historical researchers, reveals the extent to which concern for propriety and social standing influenced the handling of the case. Dr. Wilson, testifying as an expert witness, characterized Madeline's behavior not as deliberate cruelty, but as religious monomania, a term used in the 19th century to describe what might now be classified as delusional disorder with religious content. He suggested that grief over her husband's death, combined with the burden of managing a large estate, had overtaxed a feminine intellect not designed for such responsibilities. This framing, presenting Madeline as a victim of her own fragility rather than as perpetrator of calculated harm, allowed the court to intervene without directly confronting the more troubling aspects of the case. The fact that those most directly harmed by Madeline's actions were considered property rather than legal persons further facilitated this approach. The outcome of the hearing was never in doubt. On August 17, 1849, Judge Montgomery declared Madeline Thornwood of unsound mind and therefore incapable of managing her person and estate. He appointed Richard Holbrook as guardian of both Madeline personally and of the Thornwood property, with authority to make all necessary arrangements for her care and for the continued operation of the plantation. Holbrook moved quickly. On August 20th, Madeline was transported to the Mississippi State Asylum in Jackson, where she would remain until her death in 1852. The transfer was conducted quietly before dawn, with Madeline reportedly sedated for the journey. According to the asylum admission records, she arrived in a state of religious exaltation, speaking continuously of purification and the cleansing power of heated water. Dr. Marcus Phillips, the asylum's chief physician, noted in his initial assessment that Madeline appeared to have no recognition that her actions had been harmful. She speaks of her baptisms as a sacred duty, he wrote, and expresses concern for those left behind who she believes remain in a state of spiritual impurity. She has requested materials to continue her work here, a request that has, of course, been denied. With Madeline removed to Jackson, attention turned to the condition of Willow Creek Plantation and those who remained there. Richard Holbrook, acting in his capacity as guardian of the estate, conducted a thorough inventory of the property in September 1849. His findings, documented in reports to the county court, paint a picture of an estate in severe decline. The fields show signs of neglect, Holbrook wrote, with cotton unharvested and weeds growing between rows. The outbuildings are in poor repair, and many of the usual plantation activities appear to have ceased entirely. Most concerning was the condition of the workforce, many of whom showed evidence of Madeline's baptisms in the form of healing burns and psychological trauma. Carver, who examined many of those remaining at Willow Creek at Holbrook's request, reported widespread medical issues requiring attention. Beyond the visible physical injuries, he noted, there is a pervasive fear that manifests in trembling, sleeplessness, and an extreme reaction to the sound of boiling water or the sight of steam. Several individuals appear unable to speak at all, while others speak only in whispers or religious phrases that seem to have been impressed upon them during their ordeals. The east parlor, center of Madeline's activities, was found exactly as Thomas Blackwood had described it. Holbrook's inventory lists 3 iron cauldrons of varying sizes, positioned over a stone hearth, a chair placed to face them, canvas floor coverings stained with water and other substances, and walls lined with biblical texts written directly on the plaster in what appears to be charcoal. Most revealing were Madeline's personal papers, discovered in a locked cabinet in her bedroom. These included the 3 leather-bound journals mentioned earlier, containing her theological justifications and detailed records of each baptism performed. Also found were letters she had written but never sent to her deceased husband, to various religious figures, and to the editor of a New Orleans religious journal, explaining her methods and advocating for their wider adoption. It is clear from these writings, Holbrook reported to the court, that Mrs. Thornwood's actions proceeded from deeply held, if grotesquely distorted, religious convictions. She appears to have genuinely believed that she was performing a spiritual service, cleansing souls through the application of heated water to the body. This assessment aligned with the court's determination of mental instability rather than criminal intent. Holbrook faced the immediate challenge of restoring order to the plantation while managing the complex legal and financial issues arising from the situation. Colonel Thornwood's will had left everything to Madeline, with no clear provision for what should happen if she became incapacitated. The nearest Thornwood relative was a second cousin, Edward Thornwood, who resided in Virginia and who, upon being informed of the situation, expressed reluctance to become involved. In a letter dated October 3, 1849, Edward Thornwood wrote to Holbrook, "While I am naturally concerned for my cousin by marriage, I must confess that the circumstances, as you describe them, are most disturbing. I have my own family and affairs to consider, and taking on the responsibility for a distant relative's troubled estate seems inadvisable. Perhaps the property could be sold, and the proceeds used to provide for Madeline's care." This suggestion aligned with Holbrook's own assessment of the situation. With court approval, he began the process of preparing Willow Creek for sale, arranging for necessary repairs, and reorganizing the plantation's operations to restore its value. During this period, he maintained detailed records of his activities, providing a window into the aftermath of Madeline's reign. One of Holbrook's first decisions was to permanently seal off the east parlor. "The room has become a source of fear and distressing memories," he wrote in his journal on October 12, 1849. "No amount of cleaning or renovation could remove the associations it now carries. I have had the doors nailed shut and the fireplace blocked up. In time, perhaps, it can be opened again, but not while those who remember what occurred there still reside on this property." Holbrook also documented his efforts to address the medical and psychological needs of those who had suffered under Madeline's practices. Dr. Carver made regular visits to Willow Creek throughout the fall of 1849, providing treatment for physical injuries and what he termed afflictions of the spirit. His methods, progressive for the time, included allowing patients to speak about their experiences rather than suppressing painful memories. "I find that giving voice to their ordeal seems to diminish its power," Dr. Carver noted in his medical journal. "Many express similar themes: the confusion of religious authority with physical torment, the lingering fear that their suffering might resume at any moment, and most poignantly, uncertainty about whether they have indeed been purified or remain in a state of spiritual corruption." By December 1849, Holbrook had succeeded in stabilizing the plantation's operations and had begun to field inquiries from potential buyers. The property's troubled history was, by this time, widely known in the region, creating a significant obstacle to its sale. Holbrook addressed this challenge with remarkable candor, as evidenced by his correspondence with prospective purchasers. In a letter to a potential buyer from Mobile, he wrote, "I will not pretend that Willow Creek comes without its shadows. The events of recent years have left their mark both on the property itself and in local memory. However, the land remains fertile, the structures sound, and with proper management, its productivity could be fully restored. As for the more intangible aspects of its past, those are matters for individual conscience." Despite this approach, finding a buyer proved difficult. It was not until March 1850 that a serious offer came from Frederick Lansing, a Mobile merchant looking to establish himself as a planter. Lansing, who had no previous connections to Natchez society and was therefore less influenced by local gossip, purchased Willow Creek for approximately 60% of what would have been its value before the events of 1849. The sale was finalized in April 1850, with the proceeds placed in trust for Madeline's care and for the maintenance of various Thornwood family obligations. Holbrook's final report to the court, dated April 30, 1850, expresses both relief at having concluded his responsibilities and lingering concern about the property's future. "I have done what I could to restore order and stability to Willow Creek," he wrote. "Mr. Lansing seems a practical man, unlikely to be troubled by superstition or rumors. Yet I cannot help but wonder whether any amount of renovation or new ownership can truly erase what occurred there. Some places, perhaps, absorb the events they witness in ways that resist all efforts at cleansing." Frederick Lansing and his family took up residence at Willow Creek in May 1850. His initial correspondence with business associates expresses optimism about the property's prospects. "The house is grand if somewhat neglected," he wrote to his brother on May 12th. "The previous owner's illness led to certain areas falling into disrepair, but nothing that cannot be addressed with time and investment. My wife has already begun planning renovations to suit our tastes." These renovations, as mentioned earlier, included completely dismantling the east parlor, tearing out its floors, replastering its walls, and filling in the specialized hearth that Madeline had commissioned. According to the accounts of workers involved in the project, several unusual items were discovered during the process, including a small box containing locks of hair tied with thread and labeled with dates, and a leather-bound book that had been concealed within the hearth itself. This book, apparently too damaged by heat and smoke to be legible, was reportedly buried on the property at Mrs. Lansing's insistence. Despite these efforts to transform Willow Creek, the Lansing family's tenure was brief. By August 1851, Frederick Lansing had begun to make inquiries about properties available in Mobile, and in September of that year, the family abruptly returned to Alabama, leaving the plantation in the care of an overseer. In the previously mentioned letter to his brother dated November 1851, Lansing cited unspecified atmospheric conditions at Willow Creek that he believed were affecting his family's health and spirits. More revealing is a private journal kept by Mary Lansing, Frederick's wife, discovered during a 1974 research project on 19th century women's writing. In entries from July and August 1851, Mary describes a growing sense of unease at Willow Creek. "There is something about this house that resists us," she wrote on July 23rd. "The renovations never seem complete. Paint peels, wood warps, new wallpaper bubbles, as if exposed to steam. Frederick says it is merely the Mississippi dampness, but it seems to affect only those parts of the house where that woman conducted her terrible rituals." On August 10th, Mary Lansing recorded an incident that appears to have been the final impetus for the family's departure. "Last night I woke to the sound of water boiling. Frederick heard it too, a bubbling, hissing sound coming from the walls themselves. We searched the entire house and found nothing, yet the sound continued until dawn. The children are having nightmares, and even the servants are requesting to sleep in the outbuildings rather than the main house. We cannot stay here." The Lansings sold Willow Creek in December 1851 at a significant loss. The purchaser, a speculator from New Orleans named Antoine Devereux, never intended to occupy the property himself, but hoped to resell it at a profit after further renovations. His business records indicate that he invested considerable sums in updating the mansion and outbuildings throughout 1852, employing workers from as far away as New Orleans rather than local labor. "The difficulty is not in finding work to be done," Devereux wrote to his business partner in April 1852, "but in finding anyone willing to do it. The local population harbors extraordinary superstitions about the property. I have had to import labor at great expense, and even these workers will not stay after sundown. Progress is consequently slow." Devereux's renovation project suffered a series of setbacks that he detailed in increasingly frustrated correspondence. Workers reported tools disappearing or being moved overnight. New construction would be found damaged or altered in the morning, with no explanation for how it occurred. Most persistent were problems with the water system. Pipes would burst, well water would become discolored or foul-smelling, and multiple attempts to install modern plumbing in the mansion failed due to inexplicable leaks. By December 1852, Devereux had abandoned his attempts to fully renovate the property and was instead seeking to sell it in its current condition. His advertisement in the New Orleans Picayune carefully avoided any mention of the estate's history, describing it only as a substantial plantation property in Adams County, suitable for an enterprising purchaser looking to establish a presence in the lucrative cotton market. This advertisement caught the attention of James Wilson, a young planter from South Carolina who had recently inherited a substantial sum and was looking to invest in Mississippi cotton land. Wilson purchased Willow Creek in February 1853, sight unseen, relying on Devereux's written description and rudimentary sketches of the property. His decision to buy a plantation without personally inspecting it was unusual, but explained by his eagerness to complete the transaction before the planting season. Wilson arrived at Willow Creek in March 1853, accompanied by his wife, Sarah, and their household staff. His initial letters to family in South Carolina expressed satisfaction with his purchase. "The land is everything I had hoped," he wrote to his father on March 20th. "The soil is rich, the fields well situated, and the infrastructure, while requiring some attention, is fundamentally sound. The house itself is larger than we require, but Sarah is pleased with its grandeur and has already begun making it our own." This optimism was short-lived. By April, Wilson's correspondence had taken on a different tone. In a letter to his brother dated April 15, 1853, he mentioned peculiar occurrences at Willow Creek that were causing concern. "There are sounds in the night that defy explanation," Wilson wrote. "A constant dripping from walls that are dry to the touch, the distinct bubbling of water where no water should be. Sarah has taken to sleeping with a lamp burning, claiming that the darkness in this house feels different, heavier somehow, as if charged with presence." Most troubling to the Wilsons was the reaction of their household staff to the property. Within weeks of their arrival, several had requested to be released from service, citing vague but persistent concerns about Willow Creek. One longtime family servant who had been with the Wilsons since Sarah's childhood departed so abruptly that she left most of her possessions behind. When questioned by James Wilson, she would say only that this place has a thirst that can't be quenched. It was during the Wilsons' brief tenure at Willow Creek that Reverend Thomas Whitfield began his investigation of the property's history. Having heard rumors about the plantation during his previous visits to Natchez, Whitfield approached James Wilson in May 1853 with a request to examine the estate and interview anyone familiar with its past. Wilson, by this time desperate for an explanation of the unsettling phenomena he had experienced, readily agreed. Whitfield's methodical approach brought structure to what had previously been scattered accounts and local gossip. Over the summer of 1853, he compiled testimonies from former residents of Willow Creek, neighboring planters, physicians, and local officials. He examined county records, church documents, and private correspondence related to the Thornwood family. Most significantly, he was granted access to Madeline's personal papers, which had been preserved as part of the court records following her commitment to the asylum. The manuscript that resulted from this research, Heterodoxy and Harm, a study of religious delusion in Adams County, represents the most comprehensive contemporary account of the events at Willow Creek. Although rejected for publication, as mentioned earlier, Whitfield's work preserved crucial primary source material that might otherwise have been lost. Particularly valuable are Whitfield's interviews with Harriet and Solomon, the two household servants who had remained with Madeline throughout the development of her baptismal practices. Their testimonies, recorded in the summer of 1853, provide insight into how Madeline's behavior evolved over time and how it was perceived by those closest to her. According to Harriet, Madeline had always shown an intense interest in religious matters, even during Colonel Thornwood's lifetime. The mistress was always reading her Bible, Harriet recalled. But the colonel kept her grounded, you might say. When she'd start talking about visions or special revelations, he'd gently turn the conversation elsewhere. After he passed, there was no one to guide her back when her mind wandered into strange territories. Harriet described a gradual shift in Madeline's religious practices following the colonel's death. Initially, her devotions took conventional forms: extended prayer, fasting, and intensive Bible study. The transition to more extreme behaviors began, Harriet believed, after the visit from the unidentified traveling preacher in the summer of 1847. He wasn't like the regular minister, Harriet told Whitfield. He dressed plain, not like a churchman, and he spoke in a way that made ordinary words sound different, like they held secrets. He and Mistress would talk for hours in the library, their voices low but intense. After he left, she started talking about purification and the transformative power of suffering. Solomon's testimony corroborates Harriet's account, while adding important details about the practical implementation of Madeline's evolving beliefs. First, it was just hot water for washing, he recalled. She ordered the kitchen water heated hotter than normal, saying cleanliness was next to godliness. Then she started talking about internal cleanliness, washing away sin from the inside. That's when she ordered the cauldrons brought to the east parlor and had Isaiah build that special hearth. Solomon described how Madeline began experimenting with different temperatures of water, testing them first on herself. She'd dip her fingers in, then her whole hand, he said. Sometimes she'd pull back gasping, but with this look on her face, like she'd seen something wonderful. She told me once that the pain was showing her the way to salvation, that when the body suffered, the soul could see more clearly. Both Harriet and Solomon reported attempting to intervene as Madeline's practices became more extreme. "I'd tried telling her she was causing harm," Harriet said. "She just looked at me with those calm eyes and said, 'Temporary pain for eternal cleansing is no harm at all, Harriet. One day you'll understand the mercy in what appears to be suffering.'" Their attempts to seek outside help were constrained by their position and by fear of Madeline's growing instability. Solomon reported speaking with Dr. Carver during one of his visits to a neighboring plantation in early 1849, but found the physician skeptical of his concerns. He asked if anybody had died, Solomon recalled. When I said no, he said that plantation owners had always had their peculiarities, and unless there was clear evidence of fatal harm, there was little to be done. Whitfield's investigation also uncovered previously unknown details about Madeline's final days at Willow Creek, immediately preceding the August 1849 incident that led to her removal. According to both Harriet and Solomon, Madeline had begun to sleep in the east parlor itself, on a pallet beside the cauldrons. She kept the fires burning continuously, regardless of the summer heat, and was often heard talking to individuals who weren't physically present. She'd call out to her husband like he was right there in the room, Harriet testified. Other times, she'd address the Apostle John or John the Baptist, asking them questions about purification and baptism, then nodding as if listening to their answers. The last few days before they took her away, she stopped eating entirely, saying she was sustained by the steam of righteousness. The most disturbing revelation from these testimonies concerns Madeline's plans for what she called the Great Baptism, apparently intended for August 17, 1849, which would have been her wedding anniversary. According to notes found in her journal, she planned to gather everyone at Willow Creek for a mass purification ritual, using all three cauldrons simultaneously. The August 10th incident that prompted her removal to the asylum occurred during what she considered preparatory work for this larger event. Looking back, Solomon told Whitfield, "I believe the Lord's mercy showed itself by stopping her when it did." What she had in mind for that anniversary day doesn't bear thinking about. Whitfield's investigation extended beyond Willow Creek itself to explore how the surrounding community had responded to Madeline's behavior. His interviews with neighboring planters, local officials, and church leaders reveal a complex interplay of concerns, rationalizations, and deliberate inaction that allowed the situation to continue as long as it did. Judge Montgomery, speaking candidly to Whitfield in July 1853, acknowledged that rumors about Willow Creek had reached him months before he took official action. "There is a natural reluctance to interfere in the private affairs of a prominent family," he explained. "When the subject is a widow managing her late husband's estate, that reluctance is even stronger. We in positions of authority must balance individual liberty with public welfare, and that line is not always clear. Reverend Pierce, reflecting on his failed attempts to visit Madeline in 1848, expressed regret that he hadn't been more persistent. "I allowed conventional courtesy to override pastoral concern," he told Whitfield. "When she refused to see me, I should have recognized that as a sign of deeper troubles. Instead, I respected her privacy and thereby failed in my duty to a troubled soul and to those under her authority." The most forthright assessment came from Dr. Carver, who had attempted to alert authorities to his concerns in early 1849 without success. "The truth," he told Whitfield, "is that nobody wanted to confront the full implications of what was happening at Willow Creek. To acknowledge Madeline's actions would have required acknowledging the system that enabled them, a system from which many benefited and upon which our society was built. It was simpler to look away and pretend ignorance." Whitfield concluded his investigation in August 1853, departing Natchez with a manuscript that he believed would bring needed attention to the Willow Creek case and its broader implications. His disappointment at the manuscript's rejection by the Baptist Theological Review is evident in a letter he wrote to Dr. Carver in December 1854. "It seems the lessons of Willow Creek are ones our society is not yet prepared to learn. Perhaps in time, when distance allows for clearer sight, these events will be examined with the soberness they deserve." By the time Whitfield completed his investigation, the Wilsons had already departed Willow Creek. James Wilson sold the property in July 1853 to a group of investors from New Orleans who intended to divide it into smaller parcels. This plan was never realized, however, as legal complications arose regarding the precise boundaries of the estate and various easements that had been granted over the years. For the remainder of the 1850s, Willow Creek stood largely vacant, occupied only by a series of caretakers who rarely remained in the position for more than a few months. The property fell into increasing disrepair, with the once grand mansion becoming a decaying shell of its former self. Local children dared each other to approach the house, but few ventured inside, deterred by its ominous reputation and deteriorating condition. Interest in the property briefly revived during the Civil War, when the mansion served as a temporary field hospital following the siege of Vicksburg in 1863. Medical personnel who worked there reported unusual difficulties with the water supply, pipes that repeatedly burst, well water that turned cloudy or took on a foul smell, and most bizarrely, instances when water heated for medical use would suddenly begin to boil without adequate heat source. A Union Army surgeon named Dr. Edwin Palmer documented these occurrences in his medical journal, noting, "The mansion appears to suffer from significant structural problems affecting its water system. More troubling is the effect on patient morale. Many report disturbing dreams involving water and burning sensations, while others refuse to drink from any source within the house itself. We shall relocate to more suitable quarters as soon as transportation can be arranged." The hospital was moved within a week, and Willow Creek was abandoned once again. After the war, during Reconstruction, the property changed hands several times through tax sales and foreclosures. None of the various owners attempted to restore the mansion, focusing instead on farming the surrounding land, while allowing the house to crumble further into ruin. It was during this period that Willow Creek began its transformation from historical location to local legend. With the passing of those who had direct knowledge of Madeline and her baptisms, the story evolved in the telling. Supernatural elements were added. Claimed that Madeline's ghost could be seen walking the grounds with a silver ladle in hand, or that on hot summer nights the sounds of boiling water and agonized screams could be heard emanating from the ruined mansion. These legends persisted even after the house was destroyed by fire in 1876. The local newspaper, the Natchez Democrat, reported the fire as a blessing that has removed a long-standing eyesore from our county. No investigation into the fire's cause was conducted, though local rumor attributed it variously to lightning, careless vagrants, or deliberate arson, meant to finally cleanse the property of its dark associations. Following the fire, Willow Creek faded further from public consciousness. The land continued to be farmed, passing through various owners who had little or no knowledge of its history. By the early 20th century, even the name Willow Creek had fallen out of use, with the area being referred to simply by the name of whatever family happened to own it at the time. It was not until the historical revival of the 1960s, with its increased interest in preserving and documenting the antebellum South, that the story of Madeline Thornwood and Willow Creek began to re-emerge from obscurity. The microfilming of Reverend Whitfield's papers in 1962 made primary source material available to researchers for the first time, while Dr. Eleanor Simmons's brief academic treatment of the case that same year introduced it to a scholarly audience. The discovery in 1968 of additional papers from Whitfield's investigation added new dimensions to the historical record, particularly through Harriet's letter describing Madeline's early experience with boiling water and the colonel's apparent awareness of his wife's unstable tendencies. This material provided a more complex picture of how Madeline's destructive beliefs might have developed over time, rather than emerging suddenly after her husband's death. Psychological assessments of Madeline, based on the historical record, have evolved as understanding of mental health has advanced. Dr. Raymond Foster's 1994 study suggested a combination of delusional disorder and obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, while more recent analyses have proposed post-traumatic elements related to her early burning experience, possibly compounded by undiagnosed physical conditions that might have affected brain function. Dr. Marjorie Henshaw, writing in the Journal of Historical Psychology in 2001, suggested that Madeline's case represents an example of how religious frameworks can shape the expression of underlying psychopathology. In a different cultural context, her delusions might have taken entirely different forms. The religious environment of the antebellum South provided both the language and the authority structure through which her disordered thinking could express itself. The most recent scholarly examination of the Willow Creek case came in 2010, when historian Dr. Thomas Blackburn, no relation to the 1849 witness, published The Waters of Willow Creek, Religion, Power, and Violence in Antebellum, Mississippi. Blackburn's work places the events at Willow Creek in the broader context of how theological justifications were used to maintain social order throughout the American South, arguing that Madeline's baptisms represented an extreme but not entirely aberrant expression of beliefs that permeated the culture. What makes the Willow Creek case valuable to historians, Blackburn writes, is not its exceptional nature, but the window it provides into how religious ideology could be used to justify control and violence. Madeline Thornwood's practices were extreme, but they emerged from and were temporarily tolerated by a society that had already accepted the concept of righteous suffering imposed by those with power upon those without it. Today, the former site of Willow Creek Plantation is, as mentioned earlier, unremarkable farmland with no visible indication of its troubled history. The Mississippi River has shifted its course slightly since the 1840s, eroding some of the western edge of the original property. Modern agricultural techniques have reshaped the landscape, removing the old road that once led to the mansion and leveling the small rise upon which it stood. Yet local memory persists. Residents of Adams County still tell stories about the Boiling Lady and her terrible baptisms. These stories have evolved over time, acquiring supernatural elements and moral dimensions absent from the historical record. In some versions, Madeline receives supernatural punishment for her actions, doomed to feel the scalding heat of her own cauldrons for eternity. In others, she is portrayed as a victim herself, possessed by evil spirits or driven mad by grief and loneliness. For historians and psychologists, however, the value of the Willow Creek case lies precisely in its human dimensions, in what it reveals about the capacity for belief to shape behavior, about the social structures that can enable harm, and about the complex interplay between individual pathology and cultural context that allows atrocities to occur even in seemingly civilized settings. The story of Madeline Thornwood and her baptisms remains disturbing, not because it involves supernatural elements or inhuman monsters, but because it demonstrates how ordinary human psychology, operating within particular social and religious frameworks, can produce extraordinary horrors. It reminds us that the most terrifying monsters have always been human beings convinced of their own righteousness. In her final assessment of the case in 2002, Dr. Margaret Llewellyn wrote, "What continues to unsettle us about Willow Creek is not just the physical suffering that occurred there, but the questions it raises about how we understand faith, authority, and community responsibility." Madeline Thornwood was not an inhuman monster, but a human being operating within a specific historical and cultural context, a context that allowed her delusions to flourish unchecked until they produced devastating harm. Perhaps the most fitting epitaph for Willow Creek comes not from academic analysis, but from the words attributed to Samuel, Madeline's final victim. As he lay dying in Dr. Carver's clinic, "She thought she was saving us." That's the most terrifying part, not the pain she caused, but the absolute certainty in her eyes that she was doing God's work. Beware anyone who is so certain of divine purpose that they can ignore human suffering. Beware anyone who believes so firmly in cleansing others that they become blind to their own corruption. The land where Willow Creek once stood continues its quiet existence, bearing crops season after season, giving no outward sign of the suffering it once witnessed. The stone foundation of the mansion has long since been removed or buried, the outbuildings demolished, the old pathways grown over or plowed under. Nature and time have done their work of erasure. Yet something of Willow Creek remains, not in ghostly manifestations or supernatural occurrences, but in the way its story continues to resonate with those who hear it. It persists in historical records and academic analyses, in local legends and family stories passed down through generations. It survives because it speaks to something fundamental about the human condition, our capacity for self-deception, our vulnerability to twisted ideologies, and the dangers that arise when power operates without accountability or empathy. For those who study the case today, the most valuable lesson may be not about the past, but about the present, about the need to question certainties that justify harm, to resist ideologies that dehumanize others, and to remember that the most dangerous beliefs are often those held with absolute conviction. As for Madeline Thornwood herself, asylum records indicate that she remained fixed in her beliefs until her death from pneumonia in October 1852. Her final words, as recorded by an attending nurse, were, "The water calls. It's time for the final cleansing." She was buried in an unmarked grave in the asylum cemetery. Her remains later moved when the cemetery was relocated in 1901. The current location of her grave is unknown. In the decades since, many have searched for additional information about Madeline's life before her marriage to Colonel Thornwood, hoping to find clues that might explain her later actions. These efforts have yielded little. She appears in New Orleans baptismal records as Madeline Louise Beaufort, born in 1801 to Jean-Pierre and Marie Beaufort, but the family's subsequent history is sparsely documented. They seem to have been moderately wealthy, but not prominent in New Orleans society, and no records of unusual religious practices or mental instability among family members have been discovered. Madeline's transformation from conventional plantation mistress to perpetrator of systematic torture remains something of a mystery. Was it, as Harriet suggested, rooted in her early experience with scalding water? Was it triggered by grief following her husband's death? Was it the result of isolation, or the influence of the mysterious traveling preacher, or some undiagnosed physical condition affecting her brain? The historical record provides suggestions but no definitive answers. Perhaps this is fitting. The horror of Willow Creek lies partly in its resistance to simple explanation, in the way it forces us to confront the complex and often inscrutable nature of human evil. It reminds us that atrocities rarely announce themselves as such when they begin, that they often grow gradually from seemingly innocuous seeds, and that they flourish most readily when those who could intervene choose instead to look away. As development continues to reshape Adams County, with new highways cutting through former plantation lands and suburban neighborhoods expanding into what was once countryside, the physical traces of Willow Creek recede further into the past. Yet its story remains, a dark thread in the complex tapestry of American history, a reminder of horrors that occurred not in some distant land, but on familiar soil. For those who pass by the site today, commuters on the nearby highway, farmers working the fields, homeowners in the new subdivisions that increasingly encroach on the area, there is nothing to indicate what once occurred there. No historical marker commemorates the suffering at Willow Creek. No memorial acknowledges those who endured Madeline's baptisms. The land itself keeps its secrets. Yet, for those who know the story, the absence of visible reminders may be the most fitting memorial of all, a recognition that some aspects of our history resist comfortable commemoration, that some chapters of our past can be acknowledged only through absence and silence. In that silence, perhaps, lies the most profound testament to what occurred at Willow Creek, the recognition that there are some kinds of suffering for which no monument could ever be adequate. And so the story of Madeline Thornwood and her terrible baptisms continues to be told, passed from one generation to the next, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power, distorted faith, and the human capacity for both inflicting and enduring suffering. It reminds us that the most enduring horrors are not supernatural but entirely human, born not of demonic possession or ghostly vengeance, but of the darker possibilities that exist within ordinary minds and ordinary communities. As the Mississippi flows past the former site of Willow Creek Plantation, as seasons change and crops grow and are harvested, as the physical traces of the past are gradually erased by time and development, the story remains, not as a ghost story or supernatural legend, but as a historical reality that continues to disturb and instruct those who encounter it. In that persistence lies both warning and promise, the warning that human cruelty can arise in the most seemingly civilized contexts, and the promise that through remembering and understanding such episodes, we might better recognize and resist their modern equivalents. For in the end, the true horror of Willow Creek is not that it was unique, but that it was not, that it represents tendencies that persist in human societies across time and place, tendencies that require constant vigilance to recognize and counter. In this sense, the story of Madeline Thornwood and her baptisms is not merely a historical curiosity, but a living challenge, asking each new generation of hearers what they would do if faced with similar circumstances, what courage they would find to intervene when intervention is needed, what wisdom they would bring to distinguishing genuine faith from destructive delusion. As we leave Willow Creek behind, returning to the present day with its own challenges and complexities, we carry with us the memory of what occurred there, not as a burden, but as a responsibility, a commitment to remain aware of how easily belief can be twisted to justify harm, and how essential it is to maintain both critical thought and basic human empathy in the face of absolute certainty. For the waters of Willow Creek, though long since dried or diverted, continue to flow through the channels of human memory and understanding, reminding us of the price paid when righteousness becomes divorced from compassion, when religious fervor blinds us to human suffering, and when those with the power to stop harm choose instead to remain silent.